Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of medieval history's least holy women. A nun so scandalous that even the confessional booth might have needed holy water after she was done talking. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. A woman is walking down a corridor with a knife hidden in her sleeve, and the man she loves is asleep in a cell 2 floors below her. By morning, one of them will be permanently silenced, and the other will spend the rest of her life as a warning story told to every nun in England. This is not a legend passed down through vague, oral tradition. It is recorded, in detail, by a monk who lived close enough to the events to speak with people who were there. His name was Edward of Rievaulx, one of the most respected religious writers of 12th century England, and he did not write this story to entertain anyone. He wrote it as a case study in failure, meant to be read aloud as a lesson to the very institution it condemned. That alone should tell you how seriously the people who ran medieval convents took the events at Wotton Priory. To understand why this story is so unusual, you first need to understand what Wotton actually was. Most people picture a medieval convent as a single building full of women, quietly separated from the world. Wotton was something stranger. It belonged to the Gilbertini order, the only religious order founded entirely in England, and its founder, Gilbert of Sempringham, had built something almost no one else in Europe was attempting: a double monastery. Men and women lived on the same site, separated by walls, screens, and a strict set of rules designed to make sure they never crossed paths. Nuns lived on one side. Canons, the male clergy who served as priests and administrators, lived on the other. A wall ran between them, and openings in that wall were carefully controlled, used only for passing food, laundry, and the necessities of daily life between the two communities. Gilbert believed this arrangement could work because of how strictly he enforced it. Nuns were forbidden from speaking to the canons except through a small window, under supervision, for the briefest of exchanges. The entire system depended on total separation being maintained without exception, at every hour, by every person in the community. It was an experiment in willpower on an institutional scale, and for a while, it seemed to hold. Wotton itself was one of the wealthiest and most prestigious of these double houses, home to well over 100 nuns by some estimates, along with dozens of canons and lay brothers who handled the priory's farmland and business affairs. It sat in East Yorkshire, a region dotted with major religious houses, and it had royal connections. This was not some obscure backwater experiment. Wotton mattered, which is exactly why what happened there sent shockwaves through the wider church. The nun at the center of this story entered Wotton as a child. Some accounts suggest she was as young as 4 years old when she was placed there, which was not unusual for the period. Wealthy and noble families frequently sent daughters to convents at very young ages, sometimes because the family could not otherwise provide for them, sometimes because a convent offered an education no other institution would, and sometimes simply because a life in religion was considered an honorable path for a daughter the family did not intend to marry off. Whatever the reason in her case, she grew up entirely inside the walls of Wotton. She never knew ordinary life outside a convent. Every rule of that enclosed world was, to her, simply the world. As she grew older, she caught the attention of one of the young canons living on the other side of the priory wall. We do not know his name. Edward never records it, perhaps deliberately, focusing entirely on the nun's story and her punishment rather than giving the young man any lasting identity. What we do know is that the two of them found ways around the system that was supposed to make contact between them impossible. This is the part of the story that should stop you and make you think for a moment about how strict enclosure actually worked in practice. On paper, Wotton's separation was airtight. In reality, it depended entirely on humans following rules perfectly, all day, every day, for years at a time, with no real oversight beyond trust and occasional inspection. Small gaps in supervision, moments when a nun might be alone near the boundary wall, a careless door left unlatched, a sympathetic lay sister willing to pass a message. These were the cracks that widened over time into something the entire system was designed to prevent. According to Edward's account, the two began meeting in secret, at first through whispered exchanges and passed notes, and eventually through physical meetings arranged during the times the young nun was supposed to be alone in prayer or performing chores away from the main dormitory. The relationship deepened, and eventually, the nun became pregnant. Stop and consider what this meant inside a community like Wotton. It was not simply a personal failing to be quietly managed. It was proof, visible and undeniable, that the entire founding premise of the double monastery had failed. If a nun could become pregnant inside a system built specifically to make that impossible, then the reputation of Gilbert's entire order was at stake. Every double house he had founded, and every argument he had made to skeptical bishops that men and women could live side by side under God's discipline without disaster, was suddenly in question because of one pregnant 19 or 20-year-old nun in Yorkshire. The other nuns of Wotton discovered her condition, according to Ellard, more through her own visible symptoms than through any confession. And their response was not gentle correction. It was fury, the kind of fury that comes from women who feel personally betrayed by someone whose failure threatens to stain the reputation of everyone around her. Ellard describes the nuns seizing her, stripping her, and beating her, demanding she reveal the identity of the man responsible. She eventually gave them a name, whether out of pain, exhaustion, or genuine desire to see him punished alongside her. And what happened next is the part of this story that has made it infamous for nearly 900 years. The nuns, according to Ellard's account, devised a plan to lure the young canon into a trap using the pregnant nun herself as bait, forcing her to write to him and arrange a meeting under false pretenses. When he arrived, believing he was meeting her in secret as he had many times before, he was seized by a group of the priory's men, acting either on the nuns' orders or in coordination with them. What followed was mutilation. The details recorded by Ellard are graphic even by the standards of medieval punishment literature, and most modern summaries choose to describe it only in general terms. The young man was castrated, and in the account's most disturbing detail, the pregnant nun was forced to perform part of the act herself, or was made complicit in the immediate aftermath in a way clearly intended to compound her punishment with permanent trauma. If this were where the story ended, it would already be one of the darker episodes in medieval convent history. But it continues, and the next section is, in some ways, even stranger than the violence that preceded it. The nun, still pregnant, was placed in solitary confinement within the priory. She was bound in chains, in some versions of the account fitted with iron fetters at the ankles, and kept in a cell that was essentially a punishment chamber, cut off from the rest of the community. This was not a brief disciplinary measure. Sources suggest she remained in this condition for an extended period, potentially many months, while the priory tried to determine what to do with a nun who had broken her vows so publicly and so completely. And then, according to Ellard, something happened that the entire community interpreted as a miracle. The account describes a series of visions or visitations experienced by the imprisoned nun, involving figures she believed to be saints, culminating in what Ellard presents as a miraculous resolution. Her pregnancy simply ended, without childbirth, without any physical trace remaining, as though the child had never existed. Her chains reportedly fell away on their own. The community, shaken and uncertain how to interpret what had happened, eventually released her from confinement and, remarkably, allowed her to remain a nun at Wotton. Modern historians reading this account tend to interpret the miracle very differently than Ellard's original medieval audience did. Some suggest the pregnancy may have ended through miscarriage brought on by the trauma and physical abuse she had already suffered, which the community then reframed as divine intervention because a straightforward miscarriage did not fit the redemptive narrative Ellard wanted to tell. Others have suggested infanticide covered up and later mythologized. We cannot know for certain what actually happened in that cell. What we do know is that Ellard, writing for a religious audience, needed this story to end with God's mercy rather than human tragedy, because the entire point of recording it was to reassure other double monasteries that discipline, however brutal, combined with faith, could restore order even after total institutional failure. This is really the key to understanding why this story survives at all. Ellard did not write it as scandal for its own sake. He wrote it as a kind of instructional case file, meant to be read by abbots and abbesses managing their own double houses, showing them both the catastrophic consequences of allowing intimacy to develop between men and women under religious vows, and the possibility of eventual redemption if the community responded with sufficiently severe discipline followed by faith. In other words, the brutal punishment inflicted on the young canon and the imprisonment of the nun were not simply presented as excessive cruelty to be condemned. They were, in Aylward's framing, largely justified, even necessary, examples of a community protecting its integrity. Modern readers understandably recoil from this framing, and rightly so. The violence inflicted, particularly on the young canon, and the extended psychological torment inflicted on the nun, read today as horrifying rather than instructive. But understanding why Aylward wrote it the way he did tells us something important about how medieval religious communities understood transgression, punishment, and forgiveness. To them, the body's failures were dangerous precisely because they threatened the soul's salvation and the community's collective purity. Extreme punishment was not seen as excessive if it served the ultimate goal of restoring someone to God's grace. The story of the Nun of Wotton had lasting consequences beyond the priory itself. Gilbert of Sempringham, founder of the order, was reportedly deeply shaken by the scandal, and historians have long debated how much this single incident influenced the increasingly strict regulations he issued for double houses in the years that followed. Some scholars argue the Wotton case directly contributed to a gradual decline in the popularity of the double monastery model across England, as bishops and founders grew increasingly wary of an arrangement that had produced such a visible, humiliating failure. What makes this story worth remembering, nearly 9 centuries later, is not simply its shock value. It is what it reveals about the impossible standard medieval religious institutions set for themselves and the women who lived inside them. Wotton was built on the belief that walls, rules, and supervision could fully suppress human desire if enforced strictly enough. The nun at the center of this story, whoever she truly was beneath Aylward's account, spent her entire life inside a system designed around that belief, from early childhood until the events that made her famous. She never chose the walls she lived behind. She simply grew up inside them, and when the human reality of desire eventually broke through those walls, the response was not questioning of the system itself, but brutal enforcement of it. We will likely never know her name. We will never know if she survived long after these events, or what the remainder of her life at Wotton looked like once the immediate scandal faded. Aylward's account ends with her restoration to the community, framed as triumph, and history simply goes quiet after that. She disappears back into the anonymity that convent life was designed to provide, the same anonymity that had allowed her secret relationship to develop undetected for as long as it did. If there is a single lesson buried in this story, separate from the horror of its punishment, it might be this. Institutions built on the total denial of human nature rarely succeed at eliminating that nature. They only succeed at hiding it until it resurfaces in ways the institution is unprepared to handle with anything other than force. Wotton believed a wall could contain desire indefinitely. For a while, it seemed to work. And then, in one Yorkshire winter, it very publicly did not. Picture a 20-year-old woman, already famous across Paris for her intellect, being secretly tutored by the most celebrated philosopher in Europe, and picture that arrangement ending with her locked in a convent she never asked to enter, writing letters for the rest of her life to a man who could never fully explain why he let it happen. That woman was real, and by the time she died, she was one of the most respected abbesses in France. Heloise d'Argenteuil was born sometime around 1100, and almost everything unusual about her life traces back to one fact. She received an education that almost no woman of her era was given access to. Raised under the guardianship of her uncle, a canon named Fulbert attached to Notre Dame in Paris, Heloise was educated to a standard that astonished contemporaries. She read Latin, Greek, and reportedly some Hebrew, at a time when most noblewomen, let alone women without significant wealth, received no formal education at all. Chroniclers of the period describe her as the most learned woman in France, not as a polite exaggeration, but as a genuine assessment of her reputation among scholars. Her uncle, proud of her abilities and eager to see them develop further, made a decision that would define the rest of her life. He hired Peter Abelard, then the most famous and controversial philosopher and theologian in Europe, to serve as her private tutor. Abelard was, by his own later account, at the absolute peak of his fame and his arrogance when this arrangement began. He had built his reputation on defeating other scholars in public debate, drawing students from across the continent to study under him in Paris, and by his own admission, he approached the arrangement with Heloise's uncle with something close to calculation. He later wrote that he saw in Heloise not just a student, but an opportunity, believing that her intelligence and her uncle's trust would make seduction easy. What followed has become one of the most famous love stories to survive from medieval Europe, though calling it simply a love story understates the power imbalance and complexity involved. Abelard was likely close to 40. Heloise was around 20. He was her teacher, living in her uncle's household under the explicit trust that he would educate her, not pursue her. Their relationship, by both of their own later accounts, moved quickly from lessons into something far more intimate, conducted secretly within Fulbert's own home while he remained unaware. Heloise became pregnant. She was sent away to Abelard's family in Brittany, where she gave birth to a son she reportedly named Astrolabe, after the astronomical instrument, a detail that says a great deal about the intellectual world both parents inhabited even in the midst of personal crisis. Abelard, in an attempt to resolve the scandal without destroying his career, proposed a secret marriage. Marriage would satisfy Fulbert's honor and legitimize the child, while keeping the union quiet enough that it would not damage Abelard's clerical career and academic reputation. Since prominent clerics of his standing were expected to remain unmarried in practice even when not strictly forbidden from it under all circumstances of the era, Heloise, remarkably, argued against the marriage. This is one of the most striking and frequently cited details of her entire biography, because it reveals a woman thinking several steps ahead of the men around her. In letters written years later, she recalled arguing to Abelard that marriage would damage his career and reputation as a philosopher, that a wife and public domestic life were incompatible with the kind of pure intellectual pursuit he had built his identity around, and that she would rather be his mistress than his wife, valuing his love and his freedom to think over any social legitimacy the marriage might offer her personally. It is an extraordinary position for a woman in her circumstances to take, prioritizing her partner's intellectual freedom over her own social security and reputation. They married secretly regardless, at Abelard's insistence, driven largely by his need to appease Fulbert. But secrecy created its own problems. Fulbert, humiliated by what he saw as an unresolved scandal despite the private marriage, began revealing the marriage publicly against the couple's wishes, apparently attempting to restore his own honor by making Heloise's respectability as a married woman rather than a mistress, known throughout Paris. Heloise, still trying to protect Abelard's reputation as he had originally wanted, reportedly denied the marriage when asked directly, further enraging her uncle. The situation escalated in a way that shocked all of Paris. Fulbert, believing Abelard intended to abandon Heloise entirely by placing her in a convent to remove the inconvenient evidence of the marriage, arranged for a group of men to break into Abelard's lodgings at night. What they did to him became one of the most infamous acts of violence in medieval academic history. They castrated him. Abelard's own account of this event, written years later in a long autobiographical letter now known as the Historia Calamitatum, describes the attack in devastating detail, along with the public humiliation that followed. News of the castration spread through Paris almost immediately, transforming what had been a private scandal into a citywide sensation. Abelard, in the aftermath, made a decision that would permanently reshape both his life and Heloise's. He entered a monastery at Saint Denis, and insisted that Heloise take vows as a nun as well, at the convent of Argenteuil, the same institution where she had been partly raised. Notice what she is actually saying here, because it is central to understanding why Heloise's later reputation grew into something far more complicated than tragic lover. Heloise, by her own later account, did not want to become a nun. She had no particular religious calling driving her toward this life. She took her vows, according to her own later writing, purely out of obedience and loyalty to Abelard, following him into religious life not because she believed it was her true path, but because he asked it of her, and because with her marriage now publicly destroyed and her husband castrated and entering monastic life himself, She had few other options that preserved any dignity at all. She would spend the rest of her life as a nun, and eventually as an abbess. Inside an institution, she had entered for a man rather than for God. What happened over the following years is where Heloise's story shifts from tragic romance into something far more remarkable. Her rise as one of the most capable religious administrators in France. When the convent of Argenteuil was dissolved amid a property dispute years later, Abelard, who had by then founded a religious community called the Paraclete, offered the land to Heloise and the nuns who had been displaced. Heloise became the founding abbess of this new community, and under her leadership, it grew rapidly, attracting significant patronage, expanding its landholdings, and developing a reputation for intellectual and spiritual seriousness that rivaled far older, more established convents. This is the part of Heloise's story that tends to get lost beneath the fame of her earlier romance. She did not simply survive being placed in a convent against her will. She built an institution from very little into one of the most respected religious houses for women in the region, demonstrating exactly the kind of administrative and intellectual capability that had made her famous as a young student decades earlier, now redirected into managing land, finances, discipline, and the spiritual lives of dozens of women under her care. And throughout this period, she maintained correspondence with Abelard, producing what would eventually become one of the most studied bodies of letters to survive from the medieval period. In these letters, Heloise does something almost no other medieval woman's surviving writing does. She openly, repeatedly, states that she does not regret her relationship with Abelard, and that she still loves him with the same passion she felt as a young woman, despite now being a devoted and successful abbess. She writes that she took her vows for him, not for God, and that even in her role leading a religious community, her heart remains unreformed on this point, still fixed on human love rather than purely on divine devotion. This is startling material for a medieval nun to have written, let alone for it to have survived and circulated. Most religious writing by women from this period, when it survives at all, emphasizes total spiritual transformation, the complete abandonment of earthly attachment in favor of divine love. Heloise's letters do the opposite. She admits, in her own words, to still valuing human love over the religious devotion her position required her to model for the women under her leadership. Scholars have debated for centuries whether these letters represent Heloise's authentic private feelings, a kind of literary performance meant to prompt a particular response from Abelard, or even later embellishment by other hands. But whatever their precise origin, they represent one of the most emotionally direct pieces of writing to survive from a medieval religious woman, precisely because they refuse the expected narrative of total spiritual conversion. Abelard's responses to her letters are notably more restrained, more focused on redirecting her toward proper religious devotion and away from what he clearly saw as a dangerous emotional attachment unbecoming of an abbess. There is something quietly devastating in this contrast. The man who initiated their relationship, who arguably bears more responsibility for the events that led to both their ruined reputations, spends his later letters urging Heloise toward the spiritual discipline he himself had chosen more freely, while she remains far more emotionally honest about what the loss of their relationship actually cost her. Heloise continued leading the Paraclete for decades after Abelard's death in 1142, by most accounts running the community successfully until her own death around 1163 or 1164. She was, by every practical measure available to us, an effective and respected abbess, someone who took an institution built on the wreckage of her own personal scandal and turned it into a lasting, functioning religious community. So why does she belong in a chapter about infamous nuns rather than simply admirable ones? Because her infamy was never really about her actions as abbess. It was about her refusal, decades into religious life, to perform the complete spiritual transformation the role demanded of her. Medieval religious culture had a clear expectation for women like Heloise: total renunciation of earthly love in favor of divine love, particularly for someone in a leadership position responsible for modeling devotion to the women under her care. Heloise, in her own private letters, simply refused to claim that transformation had happened. She continued loving a man rather than fully redirecting that love toward God, and she said so, in writing, while holding one of the most respected positions available to a medieval woman. That refusal, small as it might seem against the backdrop of castration, secret marriage, and forced monastic vows, is arguably the most quietly radical thing about her entire story. She did not rebel through action. She rebelled through honesty, in letters she likely knew might be read by others, admitting that the life she had built, however successful, was not entirely the life she wanted, and that the man she was theoretically meant to have spiritually left behind remained, in her own words, the true object of her devotion. Heloise's tomb, and the question of whether her remains were ever actually reunited with Abelard's as later legend claimed, remains debated by historians to this day. What is not debated is the extraordinary nature of the letters she left behind, letters that turned a scandal from 12th century Paris into one of the most enduring love stories in Western literature, not because of what happened to her, but because of what she was willing to admit, in her own voice, about how she truly felt long after the world expected her to have moved on. Somewhere in Milan, near the end of the 13th century, a group of devoted followers gathered around the tomb of a woman they believed was the second coming of the Holy Spirit, and they elected her closest disciple, a nun from one of the most powerful families in the city, to become the next pope of an entirely new church. Within a few years, that nun would be burned alive by the Inquisition for the crime of accepting the title. This story begins with a woman named Guglielma, whose exact origins remain uncertain even today. Some accounts describe her as Bohemian royalty, possibly connected to the ruling house of Bohemia, who arrived in Milan sometime in the early 1260s. Others suggest more modest origins invented or exaggerated by later followers eager to give their movement noble legitimacy. What we know with more confidence is that by the time Guglielma settled in Milan, she had developed a devoted following drawn largely from the city's Umiliati religious community, a group of laypeople and religious devotees known for humility, textile work, and a somewhat looser structure than formal monastic orders. Guglielma lived a life of visible piety and asceticism, and over time, her followers began attributing increasingly extraordinary qualities to her. This was not entirely unusual in itself. Medieval Europe produced numerous holy women whose followers believed them capable of miracles, visions, and prophecy. What made Guglielma's movement unusual and eventually dangerous in the eyes of church authorities was the specific theological claim that developed around her identity. Her followers came to believe something far more radical than that Guglielma was simply a holy woman blessed with unusual spiritual gifts. They believed she was a literal incarnation of the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Christian Trinity, arrived on earth in female form to inaugurate an entirely new era of religious history. This was an almost unimaginably radical claim within medieval Christian theology, which held the Trinity as eternal and unchanging, not subject to repeated incarnation the way Christ's single incarnation was understood to be. For a religious movement to claim its founder was a second incarnation of a divine person, and a female one at that, placed it far outside anything the Church could tolerate as legitimate mysticism. According to the beliefs that developed within the movement, Guglielma's death, which occurred in 1281 or 1282, did not mark the end of her earthly life. Her followers believed she would return, much as Christ was believed to have risen, and that in the meantime, the movement needed structure to carry her teachings forward until that return occurred. This is where Manfreda de Pirovano enters the story. Manfreda came from the Visconti family, one of the most powerful noble families in Milan, a family that would go on to rule the city as dukes for generations after these events. Her connection to such significant political power is part of what made her involvement in the Guglielmite movement so consequential and eventually so threatening to church authorities. This was not a marginal figure from an obscure background. This was a woman whose family had genuine political weight in one of Italy's most important cities. Manfreda had taken religious vows, living as what sources describe as either a nun or a woman devoted to religious life within the broader orbit of Milan's religious communities, and she became one of Guglielma's closest and most devoted followers during Guglielma's lifetime. After Guglielma's death, the movement's inner circle made a decision that placed them on an irreversible collision course with the Catholic Church. They elected Manfreda to serve as pope. Understand what this claim actually meant within the movement's theology. If Guglielma had truly been a divine incarnation initiating a new religious era, the movement believed that era required its own ecclesiastical structure, separate from and superseding the existing Roman Catholic hierarchy. Manfreda, as pope of this new order, was not a symbolic leader, nor the head of a devotional sect operating quietly alongside mainstream Catholicism. She was, according to the movement's beliefs, the legitimate spiritual authority meant to guide a new phase of Christian history, implicitly positioning the existing papacy in Rome as obsolete or subordinate to this new revelation. Manfreda reportedly took her role seriously, performing functions associated with the papal office within the movement, including celebrating what followers understood as a form of Mass and hearing confessions, activities strictly reserved for ordained male clergy under Catholic Church structure at the time. The movement also reportedly developed its own cardinals, drawn from among Guglielma's inner circle, further mirroring the structure of the official church in a way that made the movement's challenge to Rome's authority unmistakable to anyone paying attention. For a period of years following Guglielma's death, the movement operated with enough discretion or enough local tolerance to continue developing without immediate intervention. Guglielma herself had, remarkably, been venerated with something close to official approval during parts of her lifetime, even reportedly receiving some support or at least tolerance from local clergy who saw her as an unusually devout, if unconventional, holy woman. Her body had initially been buried with honor at the Cistercian monastery of Chiravale near Milan, a sign that at least some ecclesiastical authorities had not immediately identified her as dangerously heretical during her life. But as the movement's beliefs about her divine status and Manfreda's papal authority became more widely known and more explicitly articulated after Guglielma's death, the Milanese Inquisition took notice, and the response, once it came, was swift and severe. Inquisitors investigated the movement thoroughly, interviewing followers and building a case against its central claims. The theological problem was unambiguous from the Church's perspective, claiming a specific historical woman had been a literal incarnation of the Holy Spirit directly contradicted core Trinitarian doctrine, and establishing a parallel papal structure with a female pope represented not just heresy, but a direct institutional challenge to the Church's authority itself. This was not a case of ambiguous mysticism that might be reinterpreted charitably. It was about as clear-cut a heresy case as the medieval Inquisition ever encountered. The consequences were severe and far-reaching. Guglielma's remains, initially buried with honor, were exhumed and burned, a punishment the Church reserved for those deemed guilty of serious heresy, even posthumously, intended to deny the condemned any resting place and to erase the physical focus of what had become a devotional cult. Several of Guglielma's followers were tried and executed as well. Manfreda de Pirovano, as the movement's elected pope and one of its most prominent surviving leaders, faced the most severe consequence available under inquisitorial law. She was tried, found guilty of heresy, and burned at the stake in 1300, alongside another prominent follower named Andrea Saramida, who had served as one of the movement's leading theological voices and organizers. The date matters here in a way that adds a layer of tragic irony to the story. 1300 was a jubilee year in the Catholic Church, a year of celebration and pilgrimage declared by Pope Boniface VIII, intended to draw the faithful to Rome and reinforce the authority and prestige of the papacy at a moment when Boniface was facing significant political challenges to his own power from European monarchs. Manfreda's execution, as a woman who had held the title of Pope within her own movement, occurred in the very year the actual papacy was staging its greatest public display of unified religious authority. The symbolism could hardly have been more direct. In the same year Rome celebrated the singular legitimacy of its papal office, Milan burned a woman who had dared to claim that title for herself. What makes Manfreda's story so striking, beyond its sheer theological audacity, is what it reveals about the space certain medieval religious movements briefly created for female authority before that space was violently closed. For a period of years, an organized religious community operated with a female figure at its absolute theological center, and a woman from one of Italy's most powerful noble families served, in the eyes of her followers, as the legitimate head of the Christian Church. This was not a fringe curiosity operating entirely outside public awareness. It involved noble families, drew enough followers to sustain a functioning parallel religious structure, and required a formal, resourced inquisitorial investigation to dismantle. The Guglielmite movement did not entirely disappear after these executions, though it was permanently driven underground and gradually faded from historical record over subsequent decades as followers either recanted, faced their own prosecutions, or simply allowed the movement to quietly dissolve rather than risk the fate of its leaders. Guglielma herself was, ironically, later remembered in some more sanitized local traditions simply as an unusually devout laywoman, with the more radical claims about her divine identity and Manfreda's papal authority gradually stripped from popular memory, perhaps deliberately, by communities eager to distance themselves from the movement's heretical conclusion. Manfreda's story asks a question that echoes across many of the women in this series. What happens when religious devotion, taken to its most sincere and complete conclusion, produces a claim to authority the existing power structure cannot survive acknowledging as legitimate? Manfreda did not seize power through political maneuvering or personal ambition in any conventional sense. She was elected by a community that believed, with total sincerity, that she held the highest spiritual authority available on earth. And that sincerity, that complete and total belief, is precisely what made her so dangerous, and precisely why the fire that ended her life in 1300 was never really about punishing a fraud. It was about eliminating a woman whose followers believed, without any doubt at all, that she was exactly who she claimed to be. A woman stands before a tribunal of some of the most powerful churchmen in France, and she says nothing at all. Not a single word in her own defense, through an entire trial that will end with her burned alive in a public square in Paris. The book she wrote, the one they are trying to destroy along with her, will outlive every single person in that room. Marguerite Porete's story begins, as far as historical records allow us to trace it, in the region of Hainaut, in what is now part of Belgium and northern France, sometime in the mid-13th century. She was almost certainly a Beguine, a member of a loosely organized movement of religious women who lived in community, devoted themselves to prayer, charity, and often manual labor such as textile work, but who did not take permanent formal vows the way nuns did, and were not bound to a single convent or a male-supervised religious order in the same way traditional monastic women were. The Beguine movement itself deserves a closer look, because it was one of medieval Europe's most interesting experiments in female religious independence. Beguines lived pious lives, often in dedicated communities called Beguines, without submitting to the full institutional control that governed convents. This relative independence made the movement enormously popular among women across the Low Countries in northern France during the 13th century, offering a religious life without requiring a dowry to enter a convent, without lifelong binding vows, and often with more personal and intellectual freedom than convent life allowed. It also, inevitably, made the Beguines a source of growing suspicion among church authorities increasingly uncomfortable with religious women operating largely outside direct clerical supervision. Marguerite emerged from this world as an unusually gifted writer and mystic, and sometime before 1296, she completed a book that would define, and ultimately end, her life. The book is known today as the Mirror of Simple Souls, and it represents one of the most sophisticated and challenging works of medieval mystical theology to survive from a female author. The Mirror describes a spiritual journey toward a state its author calls annihilation of the soul, a concept that requires some unpacking to understand why it proved so threatening to church authorities. Marguerite's mystical theology described a soul progressing through stages of spiritual development until it reached a final state of complete union with divine will, a state in which the individual soul essentially dissolves its separate identity entirely into God, becoming so perfectly united with divine love that ordinary religious practices, sacraments, and even the moral distinctions between virtue and sin become, for that soul, no longer necessary or even meaningful, because the soul's will has become entirely and inseparably identical to God's will. You can likely already sense why this raised alarm among theologians reading it. If a soul in this final state no longer needed the sacraments, no longer needed the mediating authority of priests, and existed beyond the ordinary moral framework the Church used to guide and judge behavior. The practical implications were explosive. It suggested a path to salvation that bypassed the entire institutional structure of the Church, achievable through direct personal mystical experience rather than through the sacraments and hierarchy the Church insisted were essential and non-negotiable. Whether or not this was truly Marguerite's intended meaning, and modern scholars have argued extensively that her theology was more nuanced and orthodox in intent than her prosecutors allowed. It was read by church authorities as a direct challenge to their necessity and authority. The book began circulating, and it caught the attention of Guy de Calmu, the Bishop of Cambrai, sometime before 1306. The bishop condemned the book as heretical and had it publicly burned in the town of Valenciennes, in Marguerite's presence, according to surviving records. This alone would have been a severe and frightening warning for most people, a clear signal to abandon the ideas contained in the condemned text and cease any further circulation of it. Marguerite did not stop. This is, in many ways, the single most remarkable fact of her entire story. After watching her own book burned publicly by order of a bishop, she continued circulating it, apparently revising and expanding it further, and sent copies to at least 3 respected theologians and a Beguine for their opinions, seeking validation of her ideas from figures whose approval she perhaps hoped might help legitimize her work despite the earlier condemnation. This continued distribution of a text already condemned as heretical placed her in dangerous territory, essentially daring the Church to act against her a second time. They did. Marguerite was eventually arrested by the Inquisition, brought to Paris, and held in custody for well over a year while her case was investigated. And this is where her story becomes unlike almost any other heresy trial to survive from the medieval period, because of how she chose to respond to the proceedings against her. Marguerite refused to speak. Throughout her entire imprisonment and trial, according to surviving inquisitorial records, she declined to answer the questions put to her, declined to take the oath typically required of those brought before inquisitorial tribunals, and offered no formal defense of herself or her book at any point in the proceedings. This was an almost unheard-of strategy, and an enormously risky one, because under inquisitorial procedure, refusal to cooperate with the tribunal could itself be treated as an admission of guilt, and in Marguerite's case, it very much was treated that way. Historians have debated her motivations for this silence extensively. Some interpret it as a form of principled spiritual resistance, consistent with the theology outlined in her own book, in which she may have believed that engaging with earthly judges over questions of her soul's relationship with God was itself beneath the spiritual state her mystical journey had supposedly achieved. Others suggest more practical motivations, perhaps a recognition that any answer she gave would simply be used against her regardless of what she said, making silence the only form of control she retained over an already predetermined outcome. Whatever her reasoning, her silence held for the entire duration of her trial, an extraordinary feat of resolve under what must have been immense psychological and physical pressure. A commission of theologians from the University of Paris, including figures of significant intellectual authority, examined extracted articles from her book and pronounced them heretical. On the first day of June, 1310, Marguerite Porete was burned at the stake in the Place de Grève in Paris, one of the city's principal public execution sites. Contemporary chroniclers who witnessed the execution, including at least one who was notably unsympathetic to her cause, recorded that the crowd watching was deeply moved by her composure and apparent dignity in her final moments, with some accounts suggesting her bearing during the execution actually provoked sympathy among onlookers rather than the intended demonstration of triumphant justice. Her execution occurred within the same broader wave of religious persecution sweeping through France in this period, one that also famously consumed the Knights Templar, whose own dramatic suppression was unfolding in overlapping years under many of the same political and ecclesiastical pressures. Marguerite's case is sometimes viewed by historians within this wider context of a church and monarchy increasingly anxious about independent religious authority operating outside their direct control, whether that authority took the form of a powerful military religious order or a single Beguine mystic writing a book about the soul's direct union with God. Here is where Marguerite's story takes its most remarkable turn, the one that justifies the description of this chapter as a book that would not die. Despite being condemned as heretical, despite being publicly burned not once, but effectively twice, and despite its author's execution specifically for refusing to abandon it, the Mirror of Simple Souls survived. Copies continued circulating in the decades and centuries following Marguerite's death, often without her name attached, either because scribes and readers lost track of its original condemned authorship over time, or because copyists deliberately stripped her name from the text to allow it to continue circulating without immediately identifying it as a work its author had been executed for writing. The book was translated into multiple languages, including Latin, Italian, and English, and continued to be read within mystical and monastic circles for centuries, often attributed to anonymous or male authors, entirely disconnected in the minds of many later readers from the woman who had died for it. It was not until the early 20th century that scholars definitively re-established the connection between the anonymously circulating Mirror of Simple Souls and the condemned Beguine mystic executed in Paris in 1310, reuniting Marguerite Porete with the book that had outlived every attempt to erase both her and it from history. Today, the Mirror of Simple Souls is recognized as one of the most significant and sophisticated works of medieval Christian mysticism to survive, studied seriously alongside far more famous male mystical writers of the period. Its theological complexity and literary quality, now generally acknowledged even by scholars who continue to debate the precise nuances of its orthodoxy. Marguerite herself has been increasingly reassessed by modern historians and theologians, many of whom now view her prosecution as driven at least as much by anxiety over an independent woman operating outside institutional control as by any irreconcilable theological heresy in her actual writing. What makes Marguerite Porete's story so enduringly powerful is this precise combination. A woman executed specifically for refusing to stop distributing a book, who then, through the sheer persistence of that same book across 6 centuries of anonymous circulation, effectively won the argument the Inquisition tried to permanently silence. They could burn her body. They could burn her book once, publicly, as a warning. But they could not stop copyists from continuing to transcribe it, could not stop readers across Europe from continuing to find value in it, and could not, in the end, prevent the ideas she refused to defend with her own voice from eventually speaking for themselves, centuries after the fire that was meant to end them completely. A king's mistress dies suddenly, far from court, and instead of a quiet burial in some forgotten corner of a churchyard, the nuns who receive her body place her directly in front of their high altar, drape her tomb in silk, and light candles around it, as though she were a saint. A bishop will later be so disturbed by this that he orders her remains dug up and thrown out of the church entirely. The woman at the center of this story is Rosamund Clifford, known to history almost universally by her nickname, Fair Rosamund, the celebrated mistress of King Henry II of England during the second half of the 12th century. Rosamund came from a well-established noble family, the Cliffords, and by most accounts became involved with Henry sometime in the late 1160s, when the king was already married to one of medieval Europe's most formidable and politically significant women, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry's relationship with Rosamund was not simply a private indiscretion managed quietly and discreetly, as royal affairs sometimes were during this period. By the early 1170s, the relationship had become widely known enough that it factored into the increasingly hostile relationship between Henry and Eleanor, a marriage already strained by political rivalry, territorial disputes across their combined Angevin empire, and Eleanor's own considerable political ambitions being repeatedly frustrated by her husband. Whether Rosamund's presence was a direct cause of the marital breakdown, or simply one visible symptom of a relationship already deteriorating for entirely separate political reasons remains debated among historians. But what is clear is that by the time of these events, Eleanor and Henry's marriage had become one of open hostility, eventually leading to Eleanor's imprisonment by Henry for over a decade following her involvement in a rebellion by their sons against him. Popular legends surrounding Rosamund grew increasingly elaborate in the centuries following her death. Most famously the story that Henry kept her hidden within an elaborate maze or labyrinth at Woodstock, protecting her from a jealous Eleanor who was said to have eventually discovered the secret location, navigated the maze using a length of thread, and confronted Rosamund directly, offering her the choice between a dagger and a cup of poison. This dramatic legend, as compelling as it is, has no credible basis in contemporary medieval sources and almost certainly developed generations after the actual events, layered onto Rosamund's story by later writers drawn to the dramatic potential of a royal love triangle. Eleanor was, in reality, likely already imprisoned by Henry at the time of Rosamund's actual death, making the legendary confrontation a near historical impossibility. What we do know with much greater confidence is that Rosamund died sometime around 1176, and that her death occurred at, or in close connection with, Godstow Abbey, a Benedictine nunnery located near Oxford. Rosamund had apparently retired to, or had close connections with, this convent in her final period, possibly having been placed there by Henry himself as her relationship with him wound down, or having chosen it herself for reasons that remain unclear from surviving records. What is not in question is what happened after her death. The nuns of Godstow chose to bury Rosamund in a prominent position within their abbey church, directly before the high altar, the most sacred and visible location within the entire building, a position typically reserved for the most revered founders, patrons, or saints associated with a religious house. This was, by any standard of the period, an exceptionally honored burial placement for a woman whose relationship with the king had been, by definition, a violation of the sanctity of his marriage. The nuns did not stop at simply burying her in this prominent location. According to accounts from the period, they maintained her tomb with visible devotion, decorating it with silk cloths and lighting candles around it, treatments that closely mirrored how a genuine saint's shrine or relic would typically be honored within a medieval church. Whether this treatment reflected genuine personal affection for Rosamund among the nuns, gratitude for patronage and donations her royal connection had brought to the abbey, or simply practical recognition that maintaining favor with a woman so closely connected to the king benefited the convent's ongoing relationship with royal power, the effect was the same. Rosamund's tomb had become something functioning very much like an unofficial shrine inside a convent, honoring the former mistress of a married king. This arrangement continued for years without apparent major incident, until Hugh of Lincoln, later canonized as Saint Hugh, visited Godstow Abbey sometime around 1191 in his capacity as bishop and encountered Rosamund's tomb in its prominent, honored position before the high altar for the first time. Hugh, by all contemporary accounts an unusually rigorous and principled churchman even by the demanding standards of his era, was reportedly appalled by what he found. His objection was theologically and morally direct. Rosamund had been, in the church's clear judgment, a woman who had lived in ongoing adultery with a married king, and regardless of any personal affection the Godstow nuns may have developed for her, or any practical benefit her royal connection had brought their community, her memory did not deserve to be honored in the manner typically reserved for saints and holy founders. Placing her tomb in the most sacred position within the church, treating it with the reverent trappings of a shrine, sent entirely the wrong message to anyone who visited, implicitly suggesting the church condoned or even celebrated her relationship with Henry rather than condemning it, as the moral violation church doctrine plainly considered it to be. Hugh ordered Rosamund's remains removed from their prominent position before the high altar. According to the most commonly cited account of this episode, he had her body relocated to a location outside the main church building entirely, in the convent's chapter house or an unconsecrated ground nearby, explicitly stripping her burial of the honored status the nuns had maintained for over a decade. This was an unusually direct and public rebuke, not simply of Rosamund's memory, but implicitly of the Godstow nuns themselves, whose judgment in maintaining her tomb as a shrine-like site had been publicly overruled and reversed by one of the most respected bishops in England. The reason this story earns a place in a series about infamous nuns has less to do with Rosamund herself, a laywoman rather than a nun, whose central offense in the church's eyes was her relationship with the king rather than any transgression against monastic vows. The real subject of this chapter is the choice the Godstow nuns made, and continued making for years, to honor her memory in direct tension with the church's clear moral judgment about her life. This tells us something interesting about how individual religious communities could, and sometimes did, operate according to their own internal logic and loyalties, even when that logic sat in uncomfortable tension with the wider institutional church's official positions. The Godstow nuns were not simply passive followers of doctrine handed down from above. They made an active, sustained choice, over a period of many years, to treat a controversial woman's memory with a level of reverence that invited exactly the kind of rebuke Hugh of Lincoln eventually delivered. Whether their motivation was genuine personal devotion, practical financial interest tied to Rosamund's royal connections, and the patronage that connection likely brought to their abbey, or some combination of both, their sustained defiance, however quiet and undramatic compared to some of the more violent stories in this series, represents its own form of institutional independence. A convent asserting its own judgment about who deserved honor within its walls, even against the clear preference of church authority once that authority actually paid close attention. Rosamund's story did not end with Hugh's intervention, interestingly enough. Later medieval sources suggest her tomb, even after being relocated outside the main church, continued to attract visitors and maintain some level of ongoing local reverence and popular fascination for generations afterward, evidence that Hugh's official correction, however authoritative, could not entirely erase the popular fascination Rosamund's story had already generated among ordinary people, separate from what the official church judged appropriate. Godstow Abbey itself continued operating for centuries afterward, eventually dissolved along with virtually every other English monastery during Henry VIII's sweeping dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, its buildings gradually falling into ruin, though fragments of the site remain visible near Oxford today. A quiet physical trace of a controversy that once required direct intervention from one of medieval England's most respected bishops. The deeper story here is really about the space between official doctrine and lived practice within medieval religious communities. Godstow's nuns knew, presumably, exactly what the church's position on adultery and royal mistresses officially was. And for years, they honored Rosamund's memory anyway, in the most visible and reverent position their church possessed, until an outside authority arrived with sufficient standing and conviction to force a correction they had apparently never intended to make on their own. It is a much quieter form of infamy than castration, heresy trials, or claims of papal authority, but it reveals something equally important. Even within institutions built around obedience and doctrinal conformity, individual communities of women found ways to make their own judgments about loyalty, memory, and honor, sometimes for years at a stretch, before the wider church noticed and stepped in to correct them. Imagine a bishop arriving unannounced at a convent, walking directly past the nuns' carefully rehearsed greetings, and heading straight for the wine cellar they did not know he had heard about. Then imagine him writing down, in careful Latin, exactly what he found there, filing it away in a book that would still exist 800 years later for historians to read. Everything discussed in the previous chapters of this series comes from dramatic individual cases, stories significant and unusual enough to be recorded by chroniclers precisely because they were exceptional. But there is another, quieter source that tells us something arguably more valuable about medieval convent life: the routine administrative paperwork produced by bishops doing their ordinary jobs. These documents are known as visitation records, and they offer one of the most detailed, unfiltered windows available into what daily life inside medieval convents actually looked like, far removed from either the idealized image of pure devotion or the sensationalized image of constant scandal. The practice of episcopal visitation was a standard part of church governance throughout the medieval period. Bishops were responsible for overseeing the religious houses within their diocese, and this responsibility included periodic in-person inspections, during which the bishop or his representatives would visit a convent or monastery, interview the residents individually and privately, review financial records, inspect physical conditions, and produce a written report documenting anything requiring correction. These visitations were meant to catch problems before they became serious enough to require the kind of dramatic intervention we saw with Hugh of Lincoln and the Godstow tomb. In theory, regular oversight through routine visitation would prevent small issues from ever escalating into full-blown scandals. One of the most valuable surviving collections of these records comes from Eudes Regard, who served as Archbishop of Rouen in Normandy for over 2 decades in the 13th century. Regard was known for taking his visitation duties with unusual seriousness and thoroughness, conducting far more frequent and detailed inspections than many of his contemporaries, and crucially, keeping meticulous written records of every visit throughout his entire tenure. His surviving register, covering visits to dozens of religious houses across many years, gives historians an almost unparalleled continuous record of medieval religious life as observed directly by an unusually diligent overseer, rather than pieced together from occasional dramatic incidents. What Regard's register reveals, when read carefully, is a picture of convent life that sits somewhere between the two extremes popular imagination tends to gravitate toward. Most convents, most of the time, according to his records, were functioning reasonably well, populated by nuns generally following their vows with reasonable, if imperfect, discipline. But scattered throughout the register are also numerous smaller violations and occasional serious problems, painting a picture of convent life as human, complete with the small compromises, minor rule-breaking, and occasional serious failures you would expect from any institution housing dozens of people living under strict rules for their entire adult lives. The violations documented across various convents in Regard's register, and in similar surviving registers from other dioceses across medieval Europe, cover a fairly wide range of severity. On the less serious end, bishops frequently noted issues like excessive talking during periods meant to be observed in silence, nuns wearing clothing or jewelry considered too elaborate or fashionable for their vows of simplicity, minor financial irregularities in how individual nuns managed small personal allowances they were not strictly supposed to retain as personal property under the theoretical communal ownership their vows required, and general laxity in attendance at the full daily schedule of prayers and religious services that structured convent life. Slightly more serious infractions documented across various registers include convents keeping pet animals, which seems minor to modern readers, but was considered a genuine violation of the simplicity and freedom from worldly attachment religious vows were meant to instill. Nuns leaving convent grounds without proper permission or supervision. Disputes and factional tensions between nuns that occasionally escalated into open conflict requiring the bishop's direct intervention to resolve, and issues with convents accumulating debt through poor financial management, sometimes serious enough to threaten the institution's basic operational viability. At the more serious end of what these registers document, and the material that tends to attract the most attention from modern readers and historians alike, are cases involving actual breaches of chastity vows, sometimes resulting in pregnancy, similar in nature though generally far less dramatically documented than the Wotton case discussed in our first chapter. Registers also occasionally document abbesses accused of financial corruption, misusing convent funds for personal benefit, showing favoritism in the distribution of convent resources among the nuns under their authority, or in more serious cases, essentially running their convents as personal fiefdoms with minimal accountability to either their own community or the wider church hierarchy meant to oversee them. One particularly illustrative pattern that emerges from reading multiple visitation registers across different regions and different bishops is how frequently the underlying problems traced back to basic financial strain. Convents that struggled financially, whether due to poor management, declining donations, agricultural difficulties affecting their landholdings, or simply having taken in more nuns than their resources could comfortably support, showed measurably higher rates of the kinds of violations bishops documented. Hungary, financially stressed communities, it turns out, produced far more internal conflict, rule-breaking, and desperate improvisation than well-funded, stable ones. This is, in retrospect, a fairly unsurprising pattern from a modern institutional perspective, but seeing it documented so consistently across medieval convent records adds valuable, grounded context to the more dramatic individual stories that tend to dominate popular retellings of medieval religious scandal. Another notable pattern across these registers involves the specific vulnerabilities created by the double monastery model discussed in our first chapter, and by any arrangement placing convents in close proximity to male religious communities or requiring regular male visitors for religious services, financial administration, or physical maintenance work. Registers repeatedly flag concerns about excessive or improperly supervised contact between nuns and visiting priests, traveling friars, or male estate managers handling convent business affairs, suggesting bishops were consistently aware of and consistently trying to manage the fundamental structural risk created whenever strict gender separation depended on human vigilance rather than genuine physical impossibility of contact. It is worth emphasizing, given how dramatic the individual stories in the rest of this series are, that the overwhelming majority of what these visitation records document is mundane. Most nuns documented across these registers were not secretly pregnant, were not running underground heretical movements, and were not embroiled in dramatic royal scandals. They were, according to these records, women navigating the ordinary daily friction of communal life under strict rules, occasionally cutting corners, occasionally getting into minor disputes with each other, occasionally bending rules around personal comfort or convenience in ways that would be instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever lived under a strict institutional schedule of any kind, whether religious, military, or otherwise. This mundane reality matters enormously for understanding the more dramatic stories covered elsewhere in this series properly. The Nun of Wotton, Heloise's very public scandal, Manfreda's heresy trial, and Marguerite Porete's execution were not representative of ordinary convent life. They were extreme outliers, precisely the kind of events unusual and shocking enough to generate the kind of detailed chronicle accounts that survive and get retold centuries later. Most medieval nuns lived lives closer to what Eudes Regaud's careful, methodical register describes: reasonably ordinary, occasionally imperfect, generally functional religious communities, quietly going about daily prayer, work, and communal life largely unremarked upon by history precisely because nothing dramatic enough happened to warrant special documentation. But within that broader mundane reality, the visitation records also reveal something valuable about how the medieval church actually managed the gap between its idealized vision of monastic perfection and the messy, human reality of communities made up of real people living under demanding lifelong vows. The very existence of a systematic visitation process, conducted regularly and thoroughly enough to produce records as detailed as Regaud's, shows an institution that fully expected imperfection and built ongoing mechanisms specifically to identify and correct it, rather than one naively assuming vows alone would guarantee flawless behavior indefinitely. Reading these records today offers something the more dramatic individual stories cannot: a genuine sense of texture and normalcy underneath the exceptional cases. We know, from records like Regaud's, that convents dealt with squabbles over who got the better sleeping quarters, disputes over unequal distribution of food or small luxuries, tension between older nuns and newer arrivals, and financial anxiety when harvests were poor or donations declined. These are not the details that make for dramatic documentary storytelling on their own, but they are essential context for understanding that the women behind all the more sensational stories in this series lived within institutions that were, fundamentally, made up of ordinary human beings navigating a demanding way of life, with all the friction, imperfection, and quiet daily compromise that inevitably involves. The next chapter returns to one of the more dramatic individual stories in this series, following a woman whose visions eventually brought her into direct conflict with a king. But it is worth carrying this chapter's grounding forward into that story and the ones that follow. Every single one of these more famous, more dramatic women lived within and against the backdrop of this same quiet, imperfect, largely unremarkable institutional reality that visitation records like Eudes Regaud's preserve so carefully. Understanding that backdrop is what allows us to properly appreciate just how unusual and how significant the more famous stories in this series were. A servant girl falls sick in a small Kentish village, and when she recovers, she starts speaking in a voice that isn't quite her own, predicting things no one has told her. Within a decade, she will be advising bishops, warning a king to his face, and standing on a scaffold at Tyburn as the only woman in English history executed purely for what she claimed to have seen. Elizabeth Barton was born around 1506, and for the first 18 or 19 years of her life, there was nothing to distinguish her from thousands of other servant girls working in rural England. She was employed in the household of a man named Thomas Cobb, a farmer connected to the manor of Aldington in Kent. In 1525, she fell seriously ill, and during her illness began having what witnesses described as fits, accompanied by strange utterances that sounded, to those around her, like prophecy and religious insight far beyond anything a young, uneducated servant should have been capable of producing on her own. Word of her condition reached Richard Masters, the parish priest of Aldington, who visited her and came away convinced that something extraordinary was happening. Whether Masters believed this sincerely or recognized an opportunity is a question historians still argue about, but what happened next set the pattern for the rest of Elizabeth's public life. Masters reported her case to William Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the most powerful churchmen in England. Warham, instead of dismissing the report, ordered an investigation. A commission of clergy was sent to observe Elizabeth directly, and among them was Edward Bocking, a monk from Christ Church Priory in Canterbury, who would go on to become the single most influential figure in shaping the rest of her career. The commission's conclusion was that her visions were authentic, a judgment that instantly transformed a sick farm servant into a figure with real religious authority in the eyes of the church. Elizabeth recovered from her illness, and shortly afterward entered St. Sepulchre's Priory in Canterbury as a nun, with Bocking serving as her spiritual advisor. This is the point where her story stops being a simple account of a young woman's illness and starts becoming something with real political weight, because Bocking did not treat Elizabeth's gift as something to be quietly managed within the walls of a convent. He actively cultivated her reputation, encouraging her to continue receiving visions, helping shape how those visions were recorded and communicated, and gradually building her into one of the most talked about religious figures in southern England. Over the following years, Elizabeth's reputation grew substantially. She reportedly experienced visions at a shrine dedicated to the Virgin Mary at Court Street, and crowds began traveling specifically to witness her trances and hear what she had to say. Her prophecies covered a wide range of religious and moral topics, warnings about sin, calls for greater devotion, predictions about specific individuals, and increasingly, commentary on matters of theology that a formerly uneducated young woman had no obvious means of acquiring on her own. Bocking and the small circle of clergy around her almost certainly played a significant role in shaping the content and language of what she said, though the exact balance between Elizabeth's own genuine experience, whatever that actually was, and the coaching she received from Bocking remains one of the central unresolved questions of her case. Her fame reached remarkable heights for a woman of her background. She reportedly met with Cardinal Wolsey, England's most powerful clergyman and Henry VIII chief minister for much of the 1520s. Some accounts suggest she may have even had an audience with the king himself during this period, though the details of any direct meeting are less firmly established than her interactions with other prominent figures. What is clear is that by the late 1520s, Elizabeth Barton was not a marginal curiosity. She was a nationally known religious figure whose pronouncements carried enough weight that powerful men took the trouble to hear her directly. Then, in the early 1530s, everything changed, because Elizabeth's visions collided directly with the single, most consequential political and religious crisis of Henry VIII's entire reign: his desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and Mary and Boleyn. This was not a minor policy dispute. Henry's break from Catherine, and the eventual break from Rome that followed when the Pope refused to grant the annulment Henry wanted, reshaped English religious and political life for generations. Every person of public standing in England was, in one way or another, forced to take a position on it, and the consequences for opposing the king's wishes grew more severe as the crisis dragged on through the early 1530s. Elizabeth Barton took a position, and it was an unambiguous one. She prophesied, repeatedly and publicly, that if Henry proceeded with a divorce from Catherine and married in Boleyn, he would lose his throne within months and would die an unnatural death shortly afterward. This was not vague, mystical language open to charitable reinterpretation. It was a direct, specific political prophecy aimed squarely at the king's most important personal and political decision, delivered by a woman whose religious credibility had already been effectively endorsed years earlier by the Archbishop of Canterbury's own investigative commission. For a period, remarkably, Elizabeth seems to have gotten away with this. Accounts suggest she may have personally confronted Henry with her warnings, and that figures including Bishop John Fisher, one of the most respected and eventually one of the most famous opponents of Henry's divorce, took her prophecies seriously enough to meet with her and, by some accounts, to be influenced by them in his own public opposition to the king. Sir Thomas More, Henry's chancellor and another eventual victim of the king's break from Rome, also met with Elizabeth, though More, notably more cautious than Fisher, reportedly advised her afterward to stop discussing political matters and confine herself strictly to spiritual concerns, a warning that suggests he recognized the danger of her position more clearly than she did, or was willing to acknowledge. Henry did proceed with the annulment. He married Anne Boleyn in early 1533, and had his marriage to Catherine formally declared invalid shortly afterward. Elizabeth's prophecy that this decision would cost Henry his throne within months did not come true, an obvious and public failure that should have discredited her immediately and permanently. Instead, remarkably, Elizabeth continued making prophetic pronouncements, apparently unwilling or unable to simply retreat from her position once the central prediction that had made her politically dangerous failed to materialize. This persistence proved fatal. By late 1533, with Henry's break from Rome now fully underway and his government growing increasingly intolerant of any public opposition to his religious and marital decisions, Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, moved decisively against Elizabeth and her circle. She was arrested, along with Barton and several other clergy associated with her, and subjected to interrogation specifically designed to extract a confession that her visions had been fabricated from the start, coached and manufactured by Barton and his associates for their own political and religious purposes. Under this pressure, Elizabeth reportedly confessed that her revelations had indeed been invented, though the reliability of any confession extracted under these circumstances, from a prisoner facing the full weight of Henry VIII government at the height of its intolerance for opposition, is obviously questionable to modern eyes. Whether she believed this confession, said what her interrogators needed to hear to end the pressure, or had always known on some level that Barton's coaching had shaped her public performances more than any authentic private experience, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty from the surviving records. What happened next removed any possibility of a quiet resolution. Rather than being tried through the ordinary ecclesiastical or common law courts, Elizabeth and her associates were condemned through an act of attainder passed by Parliament, a legal mechanism that allowed conviction and sentencing without the normal protections of a criminal trial. This was itself a significant and unusual step, reflecting how seriously Henry's government treated the political threat she had posed, even after her prophecy had already failed and she had already confessed to fabrication. On the 20th of April, 1534, Elizabeth Barton was executed at Tyburn, London's principal site for public execution, along with Barton and several of the other clergy who had supported and shaped her career. She was hanged and then beheaded, her head afterward displayed on London Bridge, a punishment normally reserved for offenses considered treasonous rather than purely religious or moral in nature. This detail matters enormously for understanding her unique place in English history. Elizabeth Barton remains, to this day, the only woman in recorded English history executed specifically for the crime of prophecy, treated by the state as dangerous enough to warrant the same severe treatment normally applied to traitors and rebels. Her story raises questions that stretch well beyond her individual case. How much of her public career reflected her own genuine belief, and how much was shaped, scripted, and directed by Barton and the clergy who recognized in a young, impressionable servant girl an opportunity to give their own political and religious opposition to Henry a voice that seemed to come from divine authority rather than from clergy with obvious personal and institutional interests in the outcome. Elizabeth herself left no independent written record of her own perspective. Everything we know about her comes through the accounts of men, sympathetic and hostile alike, who had their own reasons for shaping how her story was told. What seems clear, regardless of how much agency Elizabeth herself actually had in constructing her public role, is that her execution served a purpose well beyond simply punishing one woman for a failed prophecy. It was a public demonstration, delivered at the highest possible level of state violence, that Henry's government would not tolerate any form of religious opposition to his marital and political decisions, no matter how that opposition was dressed up in the language of divine revelation. Fisher and Moore, both of whom had taken her prophecies seriously enough to meet with her personally, would themselves be executed within roughly a year of Elizabeth's own death for their own separate refusals to accept Henry's break from Rome and his new position as head of the English Church. Elizabeth Barton's brief, strange career, from sick farm servant to nationally famous prophetess to executed traitor, in under a decade, captures something important about the volatile intersection of religious authority and political power in the years immediately before England's formal break from the Catholic Church. For a period of years, an uneducated young woman's visions carried enough perceived authority to draw audiences with cardinals, bishops, and possibly the king himself. And then, the moment those visions directly opposed the single decision Henry was least willing to compromise on, that same authority made her one of the most dangerous women in England, and cost her, quite literally, her head. No violence, no trial for heresy, no secret lover hidden behind convent walls. Just an abbess, a stack of forged documents, and years of quietly moving money out of a religious house until the paper trail finally caught up with her. Medieval convent corruption rarely looked like the dramatic scandals covered elsewhere in this series. Far more often, it looked like ordinary financial mismanagement, the kind any large institution handling significant property and income might experience when the person in charge decided the rules governing that property applied to everyone except her. English monastic records from the 13th through 15th centuries preserve numerous cases of exactly this pattern, and while the individual details vary from house to house, taken together they reveal a fairly consistent picture of how power, money, and weak oversight combined to produce quiet, sustained abuse inside convents that, from the outside, looked entirely respectable. To understand how this kind of corruption worked, you first need to understand what an abbess actually controlled. A medieval convent of any real size was not simply a religious community. It was a substantial economic institution, holding land, collecting rents from tenant farmers, receiving income from mills, fisheries, and other properties, managing donations and bequests left by wealthy patrons hoping to secure prayers for their souls, and often controlling valuable relics or objects that could themselves generate income through pilgrim visits and offerings. An abbess sat at the center of all of this, responsible for managing the convent's entire economic life alongside her spiritual leadership of the community. This concentration of financial control created obvious opportunities for abuse, and English episcopal records preserve a recurring set of specific violations that surface again and again across different convents and different periods. One of the most common was the sale or unauthorized alienation of convent property, land, buildings, or valuable objects sold off without proper authorization from the bishop or the wider community of nuns, with the proceeds disappearing into channels that benefited the abbess personally rather than the institution as a whole. Convent land was not supposed to be an abbess's personal asset to dispose of as she wished. It belonged, in theory, to the entire community and to God, held in trust across generations. But because the abbess held practical day-to-day control, the gap between what property belonged to in theory and what one determined individual could actually do with it in practice created real, repeated opportunities for exactly this kind of quiet theft. A second common pattern involved the misuse of designated charitable funds. Many convents received specific bequests intended for particular purposes, alms for the poor of the surrounding parish, funds designated for maintaining a hospital or almshouse attached to the convent, or money left specifically to support a set number of masses said for a deceased patron's soul. Records preserve numerous cases of abbesses redirecting these designated funds toward general convent expenses, personal spending, or simply absorbing them into general accounts where their original charitable purpose quietly disappeared. This kind of violation was particularly serious in the eyes of church authorities because it directly betrayed the specific wishes of donors who had trusted the convent to honor their exact intentions, often as a condition attached to the gift in the first place. A third pattern, somewhat less common but recorded in several notable cases, involved outright forgery. Abbesses producing or commissioning fraudulent documents to support illegitimate property claims, falsify the terms of previous grants to expand what the convent, or more precisely the abbess personally, was entitled to claim, or cover up unauthorized transactions after the fact by manufacturing paperwork that made an improper sale or grant appear to have proper authorization it never actually had. Forgery of this kind required a level of literacy, access to seals and official documents, an understanding of legal formality that most people simply did not possess. But an abbess, as head of an institution that regularly produced and preserved exactly this kind of formal documentation, was unusually well positioned to attempt it. One of the clearer surviving examples of this broader pattern comes from records concerning convents under investigation during periodic episcopal visitations similar to those covered in our earlier chapter on Ud's register. Though the specific abuses documented in cases of outright financial corruption tend to be recorded in more legal and administrative detail than the general behavioral violations Regard typically noted. When a bishop suspected genuine financial corruption rather than simple minor rule-breaking, the resulting investigation often produced extensive documentation, detailed accounts of specific transactions, testimony from nuns within the convent about irregularities they had personally witnessed, and comparison of the convent's actual landholdings and income against what earlier records showed the institution should have possessed. These investigations reveal something important about how this kind of corruption typically came to light. It was rarely a single dramatic discovery. It was usually the slow accumulation of small discrepancies noticed over years. Tenant farmers confused about who actually held title to land they had been paying rent on for generations. Other nuns within the convent growing suspicious about why the community's finances seemed perpetually strained despite apparently healthy income from rents and donations. Or a new bishop conducting his first visitation of a convent and noticing that the physical property described in older charters no longer matched what the convent currently controlled. Once suspicion was raised, the investigative process itself tended to be thorough, precisely because church authorities took financial corruption within religious institutions seriously, both because it represented a genuine moral failure inconsistent with vows of poverty and stewardship, and because it threatened the practical economic viability of institutions the wider church depended on for prayer, charity, and social stability within their local communities. Investigators would typically interview individual nuns privately, cross-reference the convent's own financial records against external evidence like tenant rent rolls and neighboring landowners' records, and, in cases involving suspected forgery, sometimes bring in outside expertise to examine questioned documents for irregularities in handwriting, seals, or formatting inconsistent with genuine documents from the claimed period. The consequences for an abbess found guilty of this kind of sustained financial corruption varied depending on the severity and duration of the abuse, her family's political connections, and the specific preferences of the bishop overseeing her case. In less severe cases, an abbess might simply be required to make restitution, repaying diverted funds from her own personal resources if she had any, or through arrangements requiring the convent to gradually recover losses over an extended period. In more serious cases, particularly those involving extended forgery or theft of property specifically designated for the poor, an abbess could be formally removed from her position, an unusual and reputationally devastating outcome for a woman who, in many cases, had likely spent years or even decades building her authority within the community before her corruption was finally uncovered. What makes this quieter form of medieval convent scandal worth including in this series, alongside stories involving castration, heresy trials, and royal mistresses, is precisely how ordinary it looks by comparison, and how much that ordinariness reveals about the practical realities of running any large medieval institution. An abbess was not simply a spiritual leader. She was, functionally, the chief executive of a substantial and complex economic operation, managing property, tenants, income, and expenditure across multiple generations of accumulated wealth and obligation. Given that reality, it should perhaps be less surprising that some abbesses succumb to exactly the same kinds of financial temptation that have tempted people placed in positions of unsupervised institutional control across every century of recorded history, medieval or otherwise. There is also something worth noting about gender in these specific cases that distinguishes them somewhat from equivalent corruption among male abbots running monasteries. which was, it should be said, an equally real and equally documented phenomenon during the same period. Convents run by women often faced somewhat closer and more frequent scrutiny from bishops than male monasteries did, reflecting the wider medieval assumption that women required more oversight and were less capable of fully independent institutional governance than men. This closer scrutiny meant that financial corruption in convents may have actually been detected and documented more consistently, relative to its true underlying frequency, than equivalent corruption in male-led institutions, where somewhat greater institutional trust and correspondingly lighter oversight may have allowed similar abuses to continue undetected for longer periods before finally coming to light, if they ever did at all. The abbesses caught in these cases rarely became famous the way the women in the rest of this series did. There was no dramatic execution, no lasting theological controversy, no romantic legend that grew in the retelling across subsequent centuries. Most simply disappear from the historical record after their removal or forced restitution, their names surviving today only within the dry administrative pages of whichever bishop's register happened to document their case in sufficient detail to survive the intervening centuries. But their stories matter precisely because of that ordinariness. They remind us that not every form of infamy attached to medieval religious women involved passion, prophecy, or persecution. Sometimes it simply involved an abbess, a set of account books, and years spent quietly deciding that the wealth entrusted to her care was, in practice if not in theory, hers to do with as she pleased, until the day the numbers finally stopped adding up. A young woman locks herself in her room on the day she is supposed to consummate her marriage, and refuses to come out. What follows is years spent hiding in the homes of hermits, disguised as a man to slip past her own family's search parties, in one of the most detailed personal escape stories to survive from medieval England. Christina of Markyate was born sometime around 1096 to a wealthy and well-connected Anglo-Saxon family in Huntingdon, and much of what we know about her extraordinary early life comes from a biography written by a monk who knew her personally later in life, giving us an unusually intimate and detailed account compared to most medieval women, whose lives, when recorded at all, tend to survive only in brief administrative mentions rather than full personal narrative. As a young girl, Christina reportedly made a private vow of virginity, dedicating herself to religious life and committing to remain unmarried, a decision her biography frames as deeply sincere and personally motivated rather than imposed by anyone else. This kind of private vow was not entirely unheard of in the period, but it also carried no binding legal weight over her family's own plans for her future, and Christina's family, prominent and ambitious, had very different plans in mind. Her parents arranged a marriage for her to a man named Berthard from another prominent local family, apparently without much regard for Christina's own private commitment to a religious life. Christina resisted this arranged marriage from the beginning, and her biography describes a sustained, multi-year campaign of pressure from her family to force her compliance, escalating from persuasion and argument into what the text describes as severe coercion, including physical mistreatment intended to break her resistance. What makes Christina's case so richly documented, compared to countless other medieval women who almost certainly resisted unwanted marriages without leaving any trace in the historical record at all, is the sheer specificity and duration of the standoff her biography describes. This was not a brief disagreement quickly resolved one way or the other. It stretched across years, involving repeated attempts by her family to force consummation of the marriage, repeated resistance and evasion from Christina, and eventually, outright flight. The marriage to Berthard was formally arranged and, according to the biography, went through some form of ceremony, though Christina apparently continued insisting the union could never be valid given her earlier private vow. Her family and new husband, naturally, took a very different view, and much of the ongoing conflict centered specifically on consummation. In medieval canon law, a marriage that had been formally contracted but never physically consummated held a meaningfully different, more contestable legal status than one that had. Christina, whether through sophisticated understanding of this legal distinction or simple determined instinct, focused enormous energy specifically on preventing consummation from ever taking place, reportedly using a combination of clever excuses, physical avoidance, and at least one occasion where she is described as engaging Berthard in lengthy religious conversation deep into the night, specifically to exhaust the opportunity for anything else to happen before morning arrived. This standoff continued for a period of years, with Christina's family growing increasingly frustrated and, according to the biography, increasingly harsh in their attempts to force her compliance. Eventually, Christina made the decision that defines the most dramatic portion of her story. She fled. Her escape was not a single dramatic dash to freedom, but a prolonged, carefully managed period of hiding, moving between the homes of various hermits and sympathetic religious figures willing to shelter her despite the very real risk this posed. Since harboring a woman who had fled her legally arranged marriage against her family's wishes was not a trivial matter to involve oneself in during this period. At one point, according to her biography, Christina disguised herself in men's clothing specifically to travel undetected past people searching for her, a detail that places her alongside a small, but notable group of medieval women whose survival stories involved this kind of gender disguise as a practical necessity rather than any deeper personal identification with living as a man. She spent significant time under the protection of a hermit named Roger, living at Markyate, the location that would eventually give her the name by which history remembers her. This period of her life, hidden away under Roger's protection, was reportedly one of considerable hardship, involving cramped, uncomfortable living conditions specifically designed to keep her concealed from anyone who might report her location back to her family, alongside genuine spiritual development as she pursued the ascetic religious life she had originally committed herself to as a young girl. The conflict eventually reached a resolution, though it took years. Christina's marriage to Berthard was formally annulled, on the grounds of her prior vow and the fact that the union had, in the end, never been consummated despite the extended period the two had technically been married. This was a significant legal and personal victory, achieved only after years of sustained resistance, hiding, and hardship, and it freed Christina to finally pursue the religious life she had originally chosen for herself as a young girl, without the legal and familial obligations of a marriage she had never wanted or accepted. Following the annulment, Christina's religious life developed substantially. She took formal vows and eventually became the head of a small community of religious women that grew up around her at Markyate, drawing other women interested in following the disciplined, ascetic religious path she herself had modeled through years of personal struggle and hardship. She developed a significant reputation for holiness during her lifetime, and importantly, cultivated a close relationship with Geoffrey, the powerful abbot of nearby St. Albans Abbey, a relationship that provided her small community with valuable protection, patronage, and institutional support it likely could not have secured on its own given its relatively modest and unofficial origins. This relationship with Geoffrey is itself a subject of some historical fascination and speculation. The two maintained what the surviving records describe as an unusually close spiritual friendship over an extended period, with Geoffrey reportedly relying on Christina's counsel and spiritual guidance in ways that suggest a relationship of genuine mutual respect and influence, somewhat unusual given the typical power dynamics between a powerful male abbot and a woman leading a much smaller, less institutionally established religious community. Some later interpretations have speculated about whether this relationship carried romantic undertones, though the surviving evidence does not clearly support drawing that conclusion with any real confidence, and it may simply reflect the kind of close spiritual partnership that occasionally developed between medieval religious figures of different genders working within the church's broader structures. What makes Christina of Markyate's story worth including in this series, distinct from many of the other more overtly scandalous women covered elsewhere, is precisely how her infamy, to the extent it existed at all during her lifetime, stemmed entirely from her refusal to comply with her own family's wishes for her future. She did nothing that violated church doctrine or teaching. If anything, her actions aligned closely with the church's own theoretical position that individuals possess the right to dedicate themselves to religious life through personal vow, and that a marriage never consummated could, under the right circumstances, be legitimately dissolved. Her real transgression, in the eyes of her own family and the wider social expectations of the period, was refusing to subordinate her personal religious calling to the marriage and family alliance her parents had arranged for entirely practical, worldly reasons of their own. Her story survives in unusually rich detail precisely because it eventually produced a happy outcome from the Church's perspective. A woman whose determined resistance to an unwanted marriage led not to ruin or scandal, but to a legitimate religious vocation, ultimately validated by both a formal legal annulment and the sustained support of one of the era's most respected abbots. This is very different from the fates of most of the other women covered in this series, and it raises an important point about why some acts of medieval female resistance were eventually celebrated and preserved for future generations, while others were violently suppressed, and, in some cases, nearly erased from the historical record entirely. Christina's biography, written by someone who clearly admired her and wanted her story remembered and celebrated, gives us one of medieval England's most detailed surviving portraits of a woman's interior life, her fears, her determination, the specific practical tactics she used to survive years of sustained family pressure, and the genuine hardship she endured in pursuit of a life she had chosen for herself against significant opposition. It stands as a valuable reminder that not every instance of a medieval woman defying powerful expectations ended in tragedy, execution, or forced submission. Some, like Christina's, ended instead in a small religious community at Markyate, built slowly and carefully by a woman who had spent years of her life proving, through sheer persistence, that she meant exactly what she said the first time she made her private vow as a young girl. Across Belgium, northern France, and Germany, thousands of women lived in their own religious communities, prayed together, supported themselves through their own labor, and answered to no husband and no formal male religious order. For a while, the Church mostly left them alone. Then it decided that was exactly the problem. We already met one Beguine directly in this series, Marguerite Porete, executed in Paris in 1310 for a book she refused to stop circulating. But Marguerite's individual story sits inside a much larger pattern, one involving an entire religious movement made up of tens of thousands of women across a wide stretch of medieval Europe. And understanding that wider pattern helps explain why her specific case turned as deadly as it did. The Beguine movement first emerged in the Low Countries during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, growing rapidly in cities across what is now Belgium, the Netherlands, northern France, and parts of Germany. The basic structure was, for its time, unusual. Beguine women lived together in dedicated communities, sometimes small individual houses grouped into larger complexes called beguinages, devoting themselves to prayer, charitable work, and often skilled labor, particularly textile production, weaving, and cloth finishing, industries that were economically significant across the same regions where the movement grew fastest. What distinguished Beguines from nuns in a formal religious order was the absence of permanent, binding vows. A woman could join a Beguine community, live a devout religious life within it for years or even decades, and later leave to marry or pursue some other path, without having violated any lifelong sacred commitment the way a nun leaving her convent after taking final vows would have. This flexibility made the movement enormously appealing to a wide range of women. Widows seeking a supportive community and meaningful religious purpose without remarrying, unmarried women whose families lacked the resources to provide a dowry large enough to secure entry into a proper convent, and women simply seeking genuine religious devotion and useful economic independence without submitting to either marriage or the strict, permanent, and often expensive commitment of formal monastic life. The movement also offered something else that proved, over time, increasingly troubling to church authorities: a meaningful degree of independence from direct male clerical control. Unlike nuns, who operated under the authority of an abbess herself answerable to a bishop, and often under the additional spiritual direction of male clergy attached to their convent, Beguine communities frequently operated with more autonomy. They elected their own leadership from among their own members, managed their own finances and daily affairs largely independently, and in many cases, developed their own distinctive spiritual and theological traditions, drawing on mystical writing and personal religious experience in ways not always closely supervised or controlled by any male religious authority standing directly over them. For roughly a century, this arrangement generally worked, in the sense that Beguine communities grew, multiplied, and largely avoided serious, sustained institutional persecution. Some individual Beguines even achieved significant recognition and respect within the wider church during this period. Mary of Oignies, an early and influential Beguine figure in the southern Low Countries, developed a substantial reputation for holiness during her own lifetime in the early 13th century, and her biography, written by a sympathetic and admiring cleric, helped establish an early model of Beguine spirituality that many later communities looked to for inspiration and legitimacy. But the underlying tension the movement represented, women living devout religious lives with meaningfully less direct male institutional control than the church, was generally comfortable extending to women, never fully disappeared, and it grew sharper over the course of the 13th century as the movement's numbers swelled and its geographic reach expanded. By the early 14th century, that tension reached a genuine breaking point. In 1311 and 1312, barely a year or two after Marguerite Porete's execution, the Church convened the Council of Vienne, a major ecclesiastical gathering that produced, among its various decisions, formal condemnation of the Beguine movement as a whole. The Council's decree, later known as Cum de Quibustum Mulieribus, accused Beguines broadly of promoting dangerous and heretical ideas, explicitly drawing a connection to the same kind of mystical theology found in Marguerite Porete's condemned book, and formally ordered the suppression of Beguine communities across the Church's jurisdiction. The immediate practical consequences of this decree varied from region to region, which is itself an important detail for understanding how medieval church authority actually functioned in practice, often unevenly, shaped as much by local political relationships and individual bishops' personal priorities as by formal doctrine issued from distant church councils. In some areas, local authorities enforced the Vienne decree aggressively, disbanding Beguine communities, seizing their property, and forcing individual Beguines either into approved formal religious orders or back into ordinary secular life under male supervision. In other regions, particularly parts of the Low Countries where Beguine communities had become deeply woven into local urban, economic, and charitable life, local bishops and civic authorities showed less enthusiasm for full enforcement, and many Beguine communities managed to continue operating in some modified form for generations afterward, often by emphasizing their charitable and economic contributions to local cities while quietly downplaying the more independent theological and spiritual dimensions of their earlier tradition that had originally attracted suspicion. This uneven, drawn-out suppression continued in various forms for decades, and it fits into a broader pattern worth recognizing across this entire series. Medieval church authorities were, in general, far more comfortable with religious women when those women operated clearly and visibly within established, male-supervised institutional structures, and grew significantly more suspicious and hostile the further any group of religious women moved toward independent organization, independent theological interpretation, or independent economic and administrative self-sufficiency. This pattern connects directly back to several of the individual stories already covered in this series. Manfreda de Pirovano's movement was destroyed partly because it developed independent theological authority entirely outside official church structure. Marguerite Porete was executed largely because she refused to stop circulating a mystical text developed and shared independently of official theological oversight and approval. And the broader Beguine movement faced sustained, if unevenly enforced, suppression precisely because it offered women a viable religious life built with meaningfully less direct male institutional control than the church was ultimately willing to tolerate indefinitely. Once that model had grown large and independent enough to represent a real and visible institutional alternative rather than a small, easily contained curiosity. It's worth being careful here not to overstate the case into pure, simple oppression narrative, because the actual historical picture is more complicated and interesting than that. Many individual bishops and clergy, across many decades and many regions, remained personally sympathetic to Beguine communities throughout this entire period of official suppression, valuing their genuine charitable contributions and evident piety, even as official church policy formally condemned their broader movement. Beguine communities in cities like Ghent and Bruges, in particular, proved resilient, continuing to exist in various adapted forms for centuries, with some beguinage surviving, in radically altered and much reduced form, all the way into the modern era. The very last true beguine, a Belgian woman named Marcella Patten, died as recently as 2013, bringing an almost 8th century tradition to its actual final end within living memory. What the Beguine movement's long, uneven history ultimately reveals is something more nuanced than a simple story of church persecution crushing independent women. It shows an institution uncertain, across literally centuries of sustained internal debate, about exactly how much independence it was willing to grant religious women, oscillating between periods of real tolerance and even active admiration, and periods of active, sometimes brutal suppression, depending heavily on local political circumstances. The specific individual bishops and civic authorities involved in any given city or region, and how directly any particular community's independent theological or organizational practices happen to challenge existing structures of authority at any given historical moment. Marguerite Porete's execution was not really an isolated, unusual event when properly understood within this wider context. It was, instead, one particularly dramatic and well-documented flashpoint within a much longer, much broader, and messier struggle over exactly how much genuine religious independence medieval Europe was prepared to grant to women who wanted to build meaningful spiritual lives substantially on their own carefully considered terms. A father takes his young daughter on a dangerous pilgrimage, and to protect her along the road, he dresses her as a boy. He dies partway through the journey. She continues alone, still disguised, and the disguise becomes the rest of her entire life. The story of Hildegund of Schönau sits in an unusual category compared to most of the other women covered across this series, because it comes down to us less as straightforward, reliably documented history, and more as a well-attested medieval legend, recorded by monks who clearly believed it and treated it with considerable reverence, but built around events that are extremely difficult to verify with real confidence through independent, corroborating sources. It's worth including here regardless, both because the legend itself was widely believed and repeated across medieval Europe for centuries, and because of what it reveals about medieval attitudes toward gender, disguise, and the specific kinds of freedom a woman could sometimes access only by disappearing entirely into a man's identity. According to the traditional account, Hildegund was born in Neuss, in what is now Germany, sometime around 1176, to a knight who, following the early death of his wife, decided to take his young daughter with him on a lengthy pilgrimage to the Holy Land rather than leave her behind. Traveling to Jerusalem in this period was a dangerous undertaking, involving lengthy sea voyages, dangerous overland travel through contested and often hostile territory, and significant ongoing risk of disease, banditry, and outright violence along the way. To protect his daughter during this dangerous journey, Hildegund's father made the decision to disguise her as a boy, dressing her in male clothing and presenting her to fellow travelers as his son rather than his daughter, likely reasoning that a young girl traveling openly through such dangerous territory faced meaningfully greater risk of assault or kidnapping than a boy would, and that maintaining the disguise consistently throughout the entire journey offered his daughter significantly better practical protection than the truth ever could. According to the legend, Hildegund's father died during the return journey from the Holy Land, leaving his young disguised daughter alone, still dressed and living as a boy, in dangerous and unfamiliar territory with no immediate family remaining to protect or guide her. Rather than reveal her true identity at this point, which would have left her extremely vulnerable as an unaccompanied young woman with no family connections or reliable protector, Hildegund made the remarkable decision to continue the entire journey home alone, maintaining her disguise as a boy throughout, apparently reasoning correctly that continuing to live and travel as male offered her better odds of safely completing the difficult journey than revealing her true identity ever would have. This alone would already make for a striking story of resourcefulness and survival under extreme pressure. But according to the traditional account, Hildegund's decision to continue living as a boy did not end once she safely completed the dangerous return journey. She continued maintaining the male disguise for years afterward, apparently finding that the freedom, safety, and practical opportunity it provided her, opportunities a young woman alone in the world, without any family or male protector, would have had virtually no access to under her true identity, made returning to openly living as a woman less appealing than simply continuing the life she had already built for herself under disguise. Living as a young man, under the name Joseph according to the traditional account, Hildegund eventually made her way into a Cistercian monastery, entering religious life as what everyone around her believed to be a young monk. This detail is remarkable when you consider it carefully. A woman successfully entered and lived within an exclusively male religious community, sharing communal living quarters, participating fully in the daily religious life and labor expected of any monk, all while maintaining a disguise that, by definition, had to hold up under close, sustained daily proximity to dozens of other men over an extended period of time, for the arrangement to remain undiscovered for as long as the legend claims. It did. According to the traditional account, Hildegund's true identity was only definitively discovered after her death, when the monks preparing her body for burial according to standard monastic practice discovered she was biologically female. This posthumous revelation reportedly caused considerable shock and consternation within the monastic community that had, entirely unknowingly, accepted and lived alongside her as a fellow monk for the duration of her time there, and the story of her true identity, once revealed, apparently spread widely enough within medieval religious circles to be recorded, preserved, and repeated across multiple later medieval texts. There's an obvious question hanging over all of this. How much of it, in specific detail, actually happened exactly as later medieval sources describe? Modern historians generally treat the Hildegund of Schönau story with real, appropriate caution, recognizing it as sitting somewhere on an uncertain spectrum between reasonably plausible historical event, embellished retelling of a real, but less dramatic underlying event, and largely or entirely invented pious legend constructed to serve broader devotional and moral purposes within medieval religious storytelling more generally. The specific details that survive come primarily from a biographical account written by a monk connected to the Cistercian order sometime after the events supposedly took place. And while the account reads with considerable narrative confidence and detail, that level of narrative confidence and detail is, on its own, not necessarily reliable evidence of strict historical accuracy, particularly for a genre of medieval writing that regularly blended genuine historical memory with clear moral and devotional purpose. What makes this story worth including in this series regardless of its uncertain precise historical accuracy is what it reveals about medieval attitudes toward gender, religious life, and the specific, narrow kinds of freedom available to women within that world, attitudes the story's wide circulation and evident popularity across medieval Europe clearly reflects. Whatever the exact literal truth of Hildegund's individual specific case actually was. Stories of women disguising themselves as men to access religious life, safety while traveling, or specific opportunities otherwise closed to them entirely were not unique to Hildegund. Similar accounts survive of several other medieval women, sometimes referred to collectively by later scholars as transvestite saints, a somewhat awkward and imperfect modern term applied by historians studying this pattern, who reportedly lived substantial portions of their lives disguised as men, frequently within religious communities specifically, before their true identities were eventually revealed, whether during their lifetime or, as in Hildegund's specific case, only after death. Taken together, rather than as isolated curiosities, these stories tell us something real about the practical, lived reality of medieval gender roles. Within a religious and social framework offering women dramatically fewer independent options than men in nearly every visible respect, from travel and personal safety to religious vocation and basic day-to-day physical safety and autonomy. The specific act of successfully disguising oneself as a man, however extraordinary and risky it clearly was, could paradoxically open up real, practical avenues of freedom and opportunity that remained otherwise completely closed to women living openly and, honestly, as themselves. A woman disguised as a man could travel with meaningfully less immediate physical danger. She could enter religious communities and pursue forms of spiritual life and religious labor not available to women within the standard convent model. She could, in a fairly direct and immediate practical sense, simply moved through the world with more basic personal safety and independence than her true identity, revealed openly, would ever have realistically allowed her. This is precisely what makes Hildegund's legend, whatever its exact factual basis, worth including here alongside the more firmly documented stories elsewhere in this series. It captures, in a single dramatic narrative, something true about the broader structural reality facing medieval women more generally, that the specific paths towards safety, genuine independence, and meaningful religious devotion were so significantly narrower and more restricted for women than they were for men that, in at least some documented and semi-documented cases across the medieval period, women found it easier and more practically viable to disappear entirely into a false male identity than to pursue those exact same basic goals honestly and openly as themselves. Hildegund's story, as later medieval Cistercian tradition eventually told and preserved it, ends with the community that had unknowingly lived alongside her honoring her memory once her true identity was finally revealed after death, treating what they had initially discovered as shocking deception instead as a genuine and remarkable, if unconventional, form of sincere religious devotion. Whether or not every specific detail happened exactly as the surviving medieval account describes, the fact that this particular story was told, widely repeated, and clearly valued across medieval religious culture tells us something important in itself. That medieval Europe, whatever its extremely rigid formal expectations regarding gender and religious life, was also, at least occasionally, capable of finding real admiration rather than pure horrified condemnation in a woman who had gone to such extraordinary, sustained lengths simply to live the kind of religious life she actually wanted. 11 women. 11 very different stories. A castrated lover in Yorkshire, a philosopher's forbidden student, a nun-elected pope, a mystic who chose silence over her own defense, a king's mistress honored like a saint, an ordinary convent's quiet daily compromises, a servant girl who challenged a king and lost her head for it, an abbess who simply decided the money was hers, a bride who ran from her own wedding night, a movement of independent women the church spent a century deciding what to do with, and a daughter who disappeared into a disguise so completely that only her death revealed the truth. If you have followed this series from the beginning, you have probably already noticed something these stories share, something that has nothing to do with scandal, romance, or violence for their own sake. Every single one of these women lived inside a system that offered them, on paper, exactly one narrow, clearly defined path: obedience. Obedience to a husband, to a father, to an abbess, to a bishop, to the entire enormous institutional weight of a church that had very specific, very rigid ideas about what a woman's religious life was supposed to look like, and very little patience for women who deviated from that script in any direction at all, whether toward passion, toward independent thought, toward financial self-interest, toward political prophecy, or simply toward disappearing into a different identity altogether rather than accepting the one she had been assigned. What makes these particular women worth remembering, centuries later, is that every one of them, in her own distinct way, found some gap in that supposedly airtight system and stepped directly into it. Sometimes that gap led to genuine tragedy, as it did for the unnamed nun of Wotton, whose trauma was recorded specifically as a warning rather than as a story anyone at the time intended to sympathize with. Sometimes it led to lasting intellectual legacy, as it did for Heloise, whose letters still get read, studied, and argued about nearly 9 centuries after she wrote them. Sometimes it led to the stake, as it did for both Manfreda de Pirovano and Marguerite Porete, 2 women whose sincere religious conviction proved, in the Church's judgment, more dangerous than any straightforward criminal act ever could have been. And sometimes, as with Christina of Markyate, it eventually led to something that actually looks, by the admittedly narrow standards available to a medieval woman, close to a genuine happy ending. There is a real temptation, telling stories like these, to flatten every one of these women into a single, tidy modern narrative. Proto-feminist heroes, every last one of them, defying an oppressive patriarchal system through sheer individual courage and conviction. That version of the story feels satisfying. It is also, if we are being fully honest with the actual historical evidence, too simple to hold up. Manfreda de Pirovano was not trying to advance women's rights in any sense a modern reader would immediately recognize. She sincerely believed, with total conviction, that a specific woman had been a literal incarnation of the Holy Spirit, and that she herself had been legitimately called to serve as Pope of an entirely new religious era. Elizabeth Barton was not simply a bold political dissident bravely speaking truth to power. She was, by her own eventual confession, at least partly a young woman shaped and directed by ambitious clergy who recognized real political and religious opportunity in her illness and her evident, unusual susceptibility to visions. Even Heloise, whose intellectual brilliance remains undeniable across nearly 9 full centuries, spent much of her actual life in a religious role she quite explicitly did not want, having entered it not from personal conviction but from loyalty to a man who had, by his own later admission, initially approached their relationship with real calculation rather than simple mutual affection. These are not simple, uncomplicated heroes. They are something more interesting than that. Real, complicated, specific human beings, making difficult and often deeply constrained choices within a system that gave them little genuine room to maneuver, and whose stories, whether ending in triumph, tragedy, or something messier and less easily categorized than either, survived specifically because they were unusual enough and dramatic enough for someone at the time to bother writing them down and carefully preserving them in a world where the overwhelming majority of medieval women's actual lived experience left no lasting written trace at all. That last point matters, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than glossed over. For every Heloise whose letters survived because a philosopher famous enough to have his own writing carefully preserved happened to fall in love with her, there were almost certainly hundreds or even thousands of equally brilliant, equally complicated medieval women whose entire lives simply vanished without any lasting written trace at all, because no one with sufficient literacy, institutional standing, and personal motivation ever thought their particular story was worth the real time, effort, and expensive materials required to write it down and carefully preserve it for future generations. The 11 women covered across this series are not remotely a representative, statistically typical sample of medieval nuns as a whole. They are the small handful of genuine outliers, dramatic and unusual enough, for good reasons or for terrible ones, that their individual stories managed to survive 9 centuries of loss, deliberate destruction, and simple accidental historical neglect. That is precisely why our earlier chapter on ordinary visitation records matters so directly here, even though it lacks the obvious dramatic appeal of castration, heresy, or a woman disguised as a monk for decades. Eudes Rigaud's quiet administrative register reminds us that behind every single one of these dramatic individual outlier stories stood countless other women whose entire lives looked more mundane. Women who followed their vows reasonably well, who occasionally broke minor rules and were quietly corrected, who lived, prayed, worked, argued, and eventually died within their convent walls without ever generating the kind of dramatic individual story that gets carefully preserved, retold, and eventually turned into a documentary script nearly 1,000 years later. So what should we actually take away from these 11 very different, often difficult stories? Once you set aside the individual shock value of castration, heresy trials, and executions that inevitably draws initial attention to each one on its own. Perhaps this. The medieval church built an enormously elaborate, carefully constructed system specifically designed to control, channel, and constrain women's religious lives into one single narrow, officially approved path. And despite the very real and often severe power of that system, women kept finding ways to exist outside its exact intended boundaries anyway, sometimes through open, direct defiance, sometimes through sheer quiet persistence over years and even decades, sometimes through complete and total disguise, and sometimes simply through refusing to fully claim the specific interior spiritual transformation the system explicitly demanded of them, the way Heloise did across her entire surviving correspondence with Abelard. None of these women set out consciously to become symbols of anything larger than their own immediate, specific lives and circumstances. They were not writing for us. and they were certainly not writing with any awareness or expectation that their individual stories would eventually become episodes in a documentary series watched by people living nearly 1,000 years after their own deaths. They were simply living, as fully and as completely as the deeply narrow and constrained circumstances available to them would actually allow, and occasionally, in doing so, they left behind a story dramatic enough, or well-documented enough, or simply strange enough, that it survived every single deliberate and accidental force working actively against it across 9 full centuries of European history. That, in the end, is really what this whole series has actually been about. Not simple scandal for its own entertainment value, and not some tidy, oversimplified narrative of heroic individual resistance either, but something closer to the messy, complicated truth. Institutions, no matter how carefully and elaborately they are constructed, are ultimately made up of real individual people, and people, across every single century of recorded human history, medieval or otherwise, have a persistent, durable habit of refusing to fit as neatly and completely into the systems built around them as those systems were originally designed to expect and require. If any part of this series has stuck with you, whether it was the nun bound in chains at Wotton, the abbess who never stopped loving a man the church expected her to have spiritually left behind, or a young woman quietly disappearing into a monk's identity for the rest of her natural life, that is exactly the reaction these stories deserve and were always intended to produce. History is at its absolute best not when it simply confirms what we already comfortably expected walking in, but when it hands us people this complicated, this specific, and this stubbornly, permanently unwilling to disappear quietly, even 900 years after their own deaths. If you want more stories like these, ones that take medieval history seriously without either sanding down its rougher, more difficult edges or flattening it into cheap, easy shock value, subscribe to the Sleepy Archive and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. The past, told slowly, one infamous life at a time.